Hi everybody. In this video, I would like to talk about two major genres of writing to help us understand what makes them different a little bit better, because I think this will be helpful for us as we move through this class and as we talk about the various readings that we'll be reading and discussing as a class this semester. So let's start with a question. How many different kinds of writing are there? Now, if you think about that, even for a few seconds, you'll realize that there are a lot. There are a lot of genres of writing or different kinds of writing. We have things that include blog posts and news sources and novels and poems and plays and screenplays and obituaries in the paper and reports and you name it, right? That's just a small handful, but there are many, many genres of writing that have existed and do exist throughout the history of human writing. So what I'd like to try to do is talk about two major genres of writing just to help give us a better understanding of the sorts of texts we might read and encounter as college students and as educated people. So genre comes from French and it essentially means type or kind. And for those of you who are a little more interested in these sorts of things, it ultimately comes from the Latin word genus, which means birth or race, and also from the Greek word genesis, which means origin or beginning. So genre really means category or type. In simple terms, a writing genre is a particular type or kind of writing that's defined by certain common purposes, conventions, and expectations. That's all a genre is. When we say a genre of writing, we are talking about a particular kind of writing that is bound by certain purposes, conventions, and expectations. Now, if I talk about movies, you'll understand that pretty quickly, right? Because we all understand when we say, what kind of movie are you watching? Or, hey, what sort of movie are you in the mood for? We can pretty quickly name off a bunch of common movie genres, right? The action movie, the romantic comedy, the drama or the tearjerker, and so on. Or, the James Bond action movie or the Avengers class action movie. All of those are different genres because when we sit down to watch them, we know we're in for a certain kind of film, which has a certain kind of purpose or set of purposes, and there are basic conventions that we know we're going to see in that kind of movie. Okay, so in writing, it's the same thing. There are different genres of writing which come with a sort of understood set of purposes and conventions that readers will anticipate and expect. Now, all I want to talk about in this video is one very basic distinction, and that is the distinction between fiction and nonfiction writing. Two big umbrella categories, which will help us, I hope, just have a sort of slightly better understanding of what we mean when we're talking about these different sorts of writing. So first off, there is fiction writing. Fiction simply means it's made up, okay? It's born from the it's born of the imagination. It's from the Latin facere, which means to make. And fiction tells a story. It's purely narrative. Our expectation is essentially that someone is going to tell us a story, and the point of what we're doing is really, at the fundamental level, listening to a story, being told a story. As a result of this, fiction has characters of some kind, it has a plot, it has some kind of conflict or set of conflicts. It may usually have a setting. It sort of takes place in a given time and place that we can identify in most cases. That's fiction, okay? Storytelling and narrative. That's the main purpose, is to tell a story. Fiction is often intended for entertainment, but it's also intended for reflection and exploration, and sometimes, actually a lot of times, in some cases, it's intended for instruction or learning. So I'm thinking in this case about children's stories, perhaps, or Aesop's fables, which are particular genres of fiction, which often do have a moral or a lesson that they're trying to teach and are trying to teach pretty explicitly. But not all fiction has to have a moral to it. It often is a vehicle for reflection and exploration of ideas. Fiction often requires interpretation of some kind, meaning that in different kinds of fiction, the meaning or the main point, if you will, may not be something that the narrator or the writer comes out and smashes you over the head with. The effect of fiction has to do with experiencing it and figuring out um, what point or points might be made in the text. Now, sometimes a work of fiction might communicate some kind of point or message, but that's not necessarily always the case, and it's not necessarily in a straightforward way. So when we're reading fiction, our primary goal is to read it, experience it, think about it, and just become part of that storytelling world. And sometimes fiction might be trying to communicate a point or set of points, but it's not doing it in some direct, straightforward way because it's not the main point of fiction, right? If your main point is actually to communicate a particular set of facts or a particular point or piece of information, you don't use fiction for that. You'd use nonfiction or you'd use an essay or something like that. So fiction can have a message or a point or set of points, but that's not its primary goal. And when it does articulate or express a point of view, it's not in a straightforward way. It works more like life does. We have to sort of sit in it and think about it, and then maybe after reflection and rereading and experiencing it, we develop some sense of, oh, I think this might be part of what this work of fiction might be trying to communicate about life in general, etc. And we should note that fiction um, can vary in length, and in fact, each of these are actually a different subgenre of fiction. Right? There are short stories, there are novellas, which are sort of longer than a short story and long enough to be published as a separate book, but they're not quite as long as what we might think of as a novel. And then there are novels, and then there are gigantic novels, and then there are novel series, and so on. And so, just for some common examples, The Lord of the Rings is a novel, actually a set of novels. Right? So they're longer and they tell a story. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, a shorter novel, which students are often familiar with. Um, Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, which is actually more of a novella. It's a little shorter than a typical novel, but it's much longer than a typical short story. And then we have a collection of short stories, such as this one, Ted Chiang's Exhalation, which is not a single story or a single narrative, but a collection of different short stories. And there are even some novellas that are in that particular collection. That's just a small sampling of the kinds of texts that would count as fiction. They are made up stories. Their principal goal of the writer is to experiment and tell a story and maybe to explore some issues that are of importance to us, but their main goal is to tell the story, is to narrate. Then, of course, we have nonfiction. That's the other big category I want us to understand. Now, this is a big category, but as you might guess from the name, it includes all writing that's primarily about explaining something or making an argument rather than just pure storytelling. So in nonfiction, the writer may have a whole range of purposes, but at the end of the day, the main purpose is to communicate ideas or findings or other facts or interpretations of the world to us. And the main goal is not just pure storytelling, but actually arguing, explaining, reporting, persuading, that sort of thing. Now, nonfiction may use anecdotes or stories or narrative, but when it does, it's doing so usually to make a larger explicit point or argument. It's not using the anecdotes or stories or bits of narrative just to tell the story and take delight in the story, but to support some larger point that's being argued. Nonfiction generally does have a clear message or argument, though it might explore or report ideas as well without having an opinion about them. So nonfiction can do that, report and or make arguments. And at the end of the day, nonfiction is primarily about informing, reporting, and or possibly explaining or otherwise communicating facts or arguments or opinions or points of view to a reader in an explicit way. That's its primary goal. And then some examples of this. I mean, nonfiction can include everything from textbooks like this Introduction to Chemistry textbook. That's nonfiction, right? To biography and works of history, such as this biography of Abraham Lincoln, to news outlets and news sources and even opinion pieces that are in news sources. Those are all nonfiction. To book-length works that express data and facts about the world and even make arguments about the world and about those facts, such as this recent book about big tech. So, one last thing we need to recall is, like everything else in life, there are some blurred lines and blurry categories. Not everything falls neatly into one category or the other. We should just note that nonfiction can often use narrative and storytelling to develop its points. I want to just highlight that for us, right? So nonfiction can, of course, use storytelling and narrative and anecdotes to make its arguments or report its facts. And also, fiction can in fact be based on real facts and people, and can even narrate true events, while also sometimes mixing pure fiction with those events. So there are some blurred lines here. I think at the end of the day, what we want to keep in mind is that nonfiction at the end of the day is about reporting facts, interpreting facts, and about making arguments and persuading people about the state of things in the real world. And fiction is primarily about narrating and the joy of storytelling, even though it can sometimes also communicate opinions and perspectives on the world in a different way as well. At the end of the day, remember that effective readers try to identify the genre of what they're reading when they read, which means they're also identifying the purposes and audiences of a piece of writing. Because again, genre has to do with the expectations and the common purposes of a kind of writing. So effective readers try to identify genre as they're reading because that can help them better understand what they're reading and what to expect from it. And this is also a tip to you to be an effective reader, which means we're always practicing rhetorical awareness. That is, we're always trying to be aware of the rhetorical context of the writing that we are reading, which means we're looking at what kind of writing is it? What's the original audience for that piece of writing? How is that writing set up? What expectations come with this kind of writing? And how well is this piece of writing meeting those expectations or not meeting those expectations? So there you have it. One basic distinction between fiction and nonfiction, and do get in the habit of being aware of what genre or what kind of writing are you reading, because I think that's going to help you become more effective readers in the long run.